Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your hosts, Michael Maleka
and Molly Hudash. All right, welcome back to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your hosts, Mike and Molly. Super excited to be here with you guys. We've got a action-packed episode prepared for you. If you missed our previous couple episodes, we were discussing 10 things that you need to know and understand in order to succeed on this exam. And today we're talking all about flashcards and Anki. Mike, I know you're excited about this because we talked about this for way too long the other day.
Yeah, and we teased it in some of the tips beforehand, and we whenever we set up to talk about these things, oh my goodness, we went on and on because I'm so excited to chat about this thing because this is something that so many people I feel one don't really know how important it is, and also maybe understand how important it is, but don't know how to really use it. Right?
Yeah. Totally. And just to set the stage, let's assume that you haven't heard of Anki, right? Or you haven't heard about spaced repetition, right? Which is the type of program that Anki, which is an app, uses, right? So let's just kind of share some definitions, right?
So I can get going.
Go for it. Anki, yeah, go for it.
Anki, I think we've all used flashcards as kids, right? We all, in learning the different definitions. Okay, what is it? Then you look in the back. Anki is essentially an online tool, like an app or a website. It's the name of the company is called Anki, and they're a web app that essentially takes flashcards and turns them into an online version. Right?
Yes. Yes. And the benefit of this, I mean, because you might be thinking to yourself, well, how is Anki different from Quizlet? Right? I know when I was younger, Quizlet was what I would always use if I wanted to make an online flashcard. The thing that makes Anki unique and the thing that makes Anki so sought after, especially by medical students, is actually the algorithm that Anki uses. So this is where spaced repetition learning comes in. So the idea is you study a card, right? You see the front, you recite what's on the back, normal flashcard stuff, right? Once you've reviewed the back, your next step is to rank how easy or difficult it was for you. And you'll select the button that corresponds to how difficult it was for you.
Yeah, it's going to be right at the bottom, outlined for you. And what happens if you say it was oh, that was super difficult? What's that going to do differently?
So basically, it's going to time out and schedule exactly when you should review that card to make sure you don't forget what you just learned or what you just reviewed. So if you say, hey, this was really difficult for me, it's going to prompt you to review that card again much sooner than if you say, hey, you know what, this was super easy, right? So the benefit here is it's going to act kind of like a little computerized tutor, right? And say, hey, this was hard. See it again in a few, minutes or days or however long you set up your settings and however many times you've seen the card. Yeah, it'll help just make sure that you don't forget all of this stuff.
Yeah. So, I think one thing that you just kind of mentioned was the settings. And I got a little bit of the settings, right? Because those, I don't know about you, Molly, but those settings, I remember when I was tweaking around with Anki, I got super overwhelmed by those settings. I'm what is all of this, right?
Yeah. I think especially because I know that this is a favorite app of med students because of the spaced repetition element, because med students are so busy, it'll tell you when you need to review something so you don't forget it. I can imagine why it's so useful. But I think because we're oh, med students use this, I want to use it right. We will go to YouTube and look up all the details and get really overwhelmed really quickly. I did that for sure. Did you too?
I remember I heard about it when I was in my MCAT studying process. A friend of mine swore by Anki. He was I use it. I swear by it. You've got to use it. I remember I went on to look up Anki, got super overwhelmed by the settings, looked up YouTube. I was I don't like this. And then
even worse.
A hot take, didn't end up using Anki at all during my studying process. And so maybe someone's here's that, and that's sacrilege. But that's me.
Right here.
That's me. Yeah. So I know, again, I will take all of the questions. I will take that heat because I want to make it very clear. It's not the only way, but it is a super useful tool. Now, again, I've worked with students, and for many students, it's extremely helpful as long as it's used right. But what if somebody's really what someone's in my situation where they're oh, super overwhelmed by Anki at first. Like what would you recommend for something like that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love that you acknowledge that we all have different approaches. Like I did use Anki, but I used it very differently than probably most of the people that are listening. So we're going to have a variety of different perspectives here on this flashcard system. So super exciting. And yeah, if you're feeling super overwhelmed by Anki, the short answer is you don't need that. You don't need all the fancy bells and whistles. You don't need to do all of these, you know, detailed adjustments to the settings and everything like that. We will share some tips and tricks for, you know, optimizing those settings in a simple, easy to digest way. But don't let it be, this incredibly overwhelming thing. That being said, we definitely do know that it can be very overwhelming, especially with just the general user interface. So just so you guys know, we did release a spaced repetition flashcard platform that's much simpler and easier to use, that's free on our website. So if you want to kind of get your feet wet, see, do I like this spaced repetition thing or not? Is it worth, making this investment, either start studying a pre-made deck or to make my own? You can always check out the free version on our website. Even Anki is actually, I think is it $25 to sync across devices?
If it's
So,
like if it's just the web app, like it's totally free. But if you want it like on a mobile device, like you have to actually like
yeah, your
pay
phone.
for it on a
Yep.
mobile device. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So ours is free if you want to just kind of
Check
get
it
your
out.
feet wet and see if you like it. But that's kind of Anki basics, right?
Hmm.
Again, it's a flashcard system that's designed to help prevent forgetting, right? And that kind of leads me to my next thought, which is like, what's the ultimate goal of Anki? Like, what is Anki designed to help you with?
Yeah, I think that we kept on bringing up this term like spaced repetition, right?
Mhm.
And this is where kind of like we're gonna bring in some psych social or MCAT content here, or we
Mhm.
like to talk about we want to retain and something that like inhibits our retention is what we call the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, right? I always called it the Ebbinghauser. We were talking about this before. We're like Ebbinghauser, and I said Ebbinghauser, and then Molly was
I
like,
was
"What
like,
is
wait a
that?
minute.
What is that? No, no, it's
I
the
don't think that's
Ebbinghaus.
his name.
It's the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. Again, see, no, notice I remembered it because I didn't forget it.
Hmm.
Haven't made an Anki card on it though. Where it's this idea that as soon as you learn something, you immediately start forgetting it. Like we were looking at the stats before, where after the first day that you learn something and you haven't reviewed it, you lose like 50% of the knowledge. And after a week, you can lose 90%, like completely forget 90% of what you just learned. Imagine after a single week of learning something, you've
Oh,
lost 90% of it. I would be so like, I don't know about you, if I learned something, like I just learned about enzymes and then 90, like a week later, I forgot all of it. Like, well, I've just wasted 90% of the time that I spent studying. Like, what do you think?
it's so hard, and I've been there myself, and I'm sure you have too. And as people that have worked with like thousands of students at this point across tutoring and courses and all of these different services we provide, I've seen this. I would say more than 75% of students are in this boat of like, I've been in my content phase for 6 months. Like I keep learning something and I find like, okay, I finally understand it. And then a week later it's gone, right? Like I don't understand what's wrong with me. Why can I not learn this? Why does it not stick? And I think it's really important to recognize the difference between learning and retention, because
Mm.
Anki is a system or spaced repetition, which we'll kind of bring up
Use
as
interchangeably.
synonymous. Yeah,
Yeah.
if we talk about Anki, Anki is designed to help you avoid forgetting something. It's not necessarily a good way to learn something for the first time, but once you've learned it, Anki's a great system to make sure that you don't forget it.
Hmm.
Um, so maybe we could talk about like what repetition does to that forgetting curve to make sure that we don't forget. What do you
Right.
think?
And so, and anyone can look this up, like what you are essentially resetting the forgetting curve. So
Yes.
every time you review it, what happens is, so of course you're not going to review it the second after you learn it, but maybe you wait a day and then you look at you review it. So what you're doing is resetting the curve back up to 100%. So maybe you lost, 50%. Again, that's extreme. But now you're essentially re-reviewing it and now you're activating it. You're activating that information in your mind and resetting it back up to 100. So then the Ebbinghaus curve resets. But the rate of degradation is far slower every time you review it. So now after a day, you don't lose 50%. Now it's like you lose 30%, right? And
Mhm.
then you review it maybe after 2 days. And then, oh, okay, you reset to 100%. And now after a day or two, you've only lost 10%. Every time you reset that, you actually reset that curve. Everyone's talking about like actually resetting it versus like thinking that you're doing that. The rate that you forget is far lower. So eventually, this information doesn't degrade at all, where it's just part of your ingrained, encoded memory that you'll never lose, right? There's so much information, and Molly, that you can agree. Like, I've taught some of this information, reviewed some of this information so much over the past 5 years. Like, I'm
Mhm.
taking some of this stuff to my grave. Like, we can talk about the different inhibitors. Like,
Yes.
I'll be like 60 and like talking about inhibitors because of just how many times like it's just ingrained in my mind.
Yes. And it's actually really fascinating. We're not going to get too into depth here with
Mhm.
neurobiology, but it really is. Every time you review it, you're strengthening those synaptic connections, right?
Mhm.
Like those neural pathways that are associated with that information in your brain. It's fascinating. Go dive in. Maybe we'll talk about the neurobiology of learning in a future episode because
Another
it's
episode,
really
definitely.
cool.
So
But
cool.
every time you review, you're strengthening those connections in your brain and making it easier and faster to recall, right? So however you choose to approach retention, know that you've got a hugely beneficial tool at your fingertips. Like Mike, you don't have to use it,
Mhm.
right? But it is something that is very accessible and it it's pretty well self-scheduled. So it doesn't take a lot of effort on the front end for you to, manually schedule this stuff, right? It's a system that provides a lot of help and
Right.
assistance.
Right.
So the goal of the episode is to talk about again what Anki is, which we've kind of covered, and how to use it effectively. But before we do, I actually really want to know, Mike, if you didn't use Anki, how did you retain info?
What a great question. So my process was very practice oriented. So
Okay.
I implemented practice questions very, very early on in my studying. And so I had sort of two purposes for practice questions. I had the practice questions where I just learned a subject. I am now going to do practice questions on that subject to make sure that I learned it. But then on a weekly basis, I would do like a set of just questions randomly assorted from the topic areas I've covered, and that
Hmm,
would direct me as to what to review. So
I like
rather
that.
than like an Anki version, right, where it's like, okay, like the recall or like the spreading activation, I use practice questions as my
I
review
love,
tool.
I love
Um,
that.
and so again, that was something I loved. I am such a huge proponent of like learning from your practice, learning
Hmm.
what you need to learn from your practice. I know it's not for everyone because I'm going to be completely honest. If you are not oriented with the goal that I am doing this so I can learn and review, it can be
Yeah.
super frustrating because you'll get questions wrong and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm getting questions wrong. No, it's a sign that like this is a learning area, not for everybody. And this is where I love talking about like Molly is super Anki, like Anki queen, to be honest. I'm very much into like practice questions. I recognize Anki is important. I use it nowadays, but like when I was in my studying, so that's why I think it's so great that we're talking about these things today.
Yeah, and I love that you bring up practice. We're going to talk a lot about this towards the end of the episode as well, because ultimately you want to know, and I am someone who is I've been a teacher for a long, long time now. I'm very passionate about like educational theory and the design of materials and how that shapes how you learn it. You want to be recognizing the point of the tool you're using.
Mm,
Again, Anki as a whole or spaced repetition as a whole is meant for retention. And we also can talk about practice questions as a tool for retention. But even within a category, like you were saying, you can have questions that are meant to kind of reinforce what you've learned. And then you can also do things like practice exams that give you a very varied review.
mm,
But even within Anki, there are lots of different types of cards that will help you learn in different ways,
mhm,
right? So I want to kind of go over just the three main types of Anki cards, like the actual structure of the cards themselves, and how those could be used to shape your learning, right? So the first one that is the most commonly used is a closed deletion.
And I know your feelings about this, Molly. I
Yes.
know what you think about this one, but
Yes.
why
Might
don't
you
you
take
tell?
this?
So closed deletion cards are those kinds of cards that are sort of like the fill in the blank cards, where there's maybe a definition that's like missing one word, or maybe there's a term or maybe a structure, and you have to say, the example that we were talking about before is like the pK of histidine, okay, is blank, right? Those are the kind of like cards where you just fill in the blanks. And so again, I love this. We're like coming into this with like be really intentional about why you're using each card or why you're
Mhm.
using each resource. Closed deletion cards, right? Very, very good for memorizing things, right?
Yes.
I mean, talk to me about your feelings when you hear closed deletion cards, Molly.
I love that you know me well enough to have taken that so I don't have to explain it.
Mhm.
I actually, so I have very strongly mixed feelings about clothes. Like you said, they're designed to help you memorize stuff, right? Again, most of the time it's a sentence definition and a term is missing, right? Or a number is missing, or whatever it is. You could also have a picture missing, but the goal is just what should fill in the blank, right? And that can be really useful if, like you said, you're trying to remember the pK of histidine. That's just a number that you have to associate with histidine. Like there's not you can understand it, but like at the end of the day, you need to know that number and you need to associate it with histidine, right? Closed deletion is perfect for that kind of card, but it's not a good way to learn or to retain conceptual relationships, right? It's not understanding based, right? It's memorization based, which is why I have very mixed feelings, right? If you want to remember what you understood about a topic, or if you want to know something well enough that you could explain it to someone else, or that you could get a question right on the MCAT that's asking you to apply that knowledge to a new context, you really need more than a closed deletion can offer. So the type that I tend to favor, right, for things beyond just rote memorization is more of an open-ended traditional flashcard format. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but think traditional flashcard. Front side, describe the photoelectric effect. Back side, all the information you would need to know about photoelectric effect. These are great for understanding. Sometimes it's more than you need. Again, if it's a simple thing that you need to memorize, you don't need an open-ended question. But those are the ones that I think help prepare you the most for the types of questions you will see on the test.
Right. So I know you love those open-ended cards, like making them is like that learning process. We can talk about more about how to use these different card types. So there's the closed deletion, there's the open-ended, and like our last card type, right? Which is the image occlusion cards, where I personally love these ones
Mhm.
because I love seeing a picture because I'm a very visual learner. Like if I look up something, I don't like seeing a definition. I want to see a picture of it. And
Yeah.
so and especially for like the biology concepts where you're looking at
Yes.
structures, like the structures of the nephron, like if you a great image occlusion example would be like point to which structure, does the most of the taking water out of the nephron, for example. Again, I'm just kind of making something up at the point. And like looking at the image and actually pointing like, okay, it's this structure here. All right, on the backside with an arrow with the structure, right? Where it's all image focused. Right. Well,
Mhm.
what are your thoughts on the image occlusion cards?
So I've not messed around with it a ton just because I personally don't know how to set it up in Anki, like
Got
how
it.
to upload the
Got it.
picture and where to and what should pop up. But I have downloaded a pre-made deck before, especially for anatomy, right?
Mm,
Like for these very visual subjects, again, bio and anatomy and physiology are big ones. They're super helpful, right?
mhm,
If you see the humerus, right, and I know that there are a ton of different structures on the humerus that I need to be familiar with, a closely or an image occlusion is super useful for that. And that's something that would be difficult to set up in either of the other card types, right?
mhm,
So it is definitely a type of card that you can use. Definitely watch a YouTube video on how to set it up. I have not made that journey myself, but there are a lot of pre-made decks out there that have those made for you.
mm,
And that's actually kind of a good little segue because ultimately, I think a lot of students newer to Anki may not know that there are a ton of pre-made MCAT flashcard decks that are Anki compatible that are available. And a lot of people download these on the internet and just use them for their studying. So Mike, why don't you share what resources are out there so we can kind of structure our chat about them?
Yeah, right. So the pre-made decks, again, to preface, are these decks that somebody else has made. Like,
Yes.
you don't have to go to the process of making each and every card. Again, pros and cons with that. But somebody has made, and some of these decks have thousands of cards already there. And so what you can simply do is just download cards somebody else has generated and begin using them. And so there's some very popular ones that are out there. I'm sure if you've gone on Reddit, you've seen all these ones. But probably the most popular one is one of the most popular ones are the Miles Down deck, and the Anki version is like a polished Miles Down deck, as well as the Jack Sparrow deck, right, is also pretty popular, pre-made MCAT deck. Yeah, so those are kind of like probably the two. I'm sure there's so many out there, but probably those are the two I hear about the most and that my students use.
Yes, Mile Down especially. I feel like Jack Sparrow, it's kind of funny because I come to Anki with a very open-ended framework, right? That's what I like it for, is those open-ended questions. So I personally love Jack Sparrow. They are mostly open-ended questions. The types of questions posed there are very advanced. They're very based on making connections and helping you actually understand things, and again, retain that understanding. Mile Down is the most common though. Most common. The Mile Down, just to provide some insight on structure, is all closed deletion cards.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a love-hate with Mile Down. It's a great resource for those memorization-based concepts, but everything is closed deletion. So
Mm-hmm.
they've got a sentence, typically one sentence, sometimes a little bit more, but typically one sentence definition with a word removed, and your goal is to say what fills in the blank. The hard part here is your brain is a phenomenally fascinating
Amazing.
organ,
Beautiful
and
thing. Beautiful thing.
it will start filling in the blanks for you just because it recognizes the visual pattern of the definition, and it will remember what fills in the blanks even without having read it, without having understood.
Mm-hmm.
So just be mindful.
Great.
Be mindful about the
Mhm.
way that you're studying. Again, each of these cards has a different purpose. And ultimately, we're going to talk more about how to use them effectively.
Right.
Just to share a couple other of the pre-made decks. Mile Down on King, right, and Jack Sparrow are big ones. We do have these on our website. By the way, if you're unsure of where to find them, all of these are on Reddit. So if you look up Mile Down or Jack Sparrow deck, Anki, Reddit, they'll pop up as a place to download them into the Anki app. If you prefer, again, we do have the free version on our website. We already found and located all of these decks. We did do a polished version of the Mile Down as well. And we have a couple extras, a couple that I actually made myself.
Mhm.
We've got a very comprehensive amino acids deck that has, like, the front side will have either the structure or the name or the abbreviation, and different things will be placed on the back. I think there's 6 different subdecks to make sure that you can recognize amino acids from any different angle, all the unique characteristics, stuff like that. And we also have a social science research methods deck on our platform as well. So just wanted to let you guys know that those are out there. You can either find these on Reddit and download them into the Anki app, or you could use the website, just jackwestin.com, under the flashcards tab, to access all of this stuff in a pre-organized way.
Without all the bells and whistles that can be
Yeah.
sometimes a little bit daunting. So I
Yes.
personally, like, I remember when I checked those out, I was like, oh, this is so nice. Like, oh, this would have been great if I, was in this process. Again, this was like 5 years ago now when I
Yeah.
was doing this, but I would have loved to have something that was a little bit more simple. But yeah,
Yes.
I think I think it's really important that, again, that we talked about the intentional about like each different type of card. Again, hearing you talking about the closed deletion again has a purpose, right? And
Yes.
how the brain's a beautiful thing. I think one thing I want to add is when that brain completes it, you don't actually have to think about the card. Remember we were talking about how resetting the Ebbinghaus curve.
Hmm.
If your brain just completes the sentence and you didn't actually have to think about it, you're not actually resetting your Ebbinghaus curve. So you're thinking, and this is probably one of the most common things I see with students. It's like they're like, Mike, I'm doing my miles down cards. Like I'm doing my cards. I keep forgetting things,
Yeah.
thinking, oh, I thought I'm resetting. I thought I'm doing everything right. But it's because of these like kind of things our brain does where it just completes the blank rather than understands it, where we're not actually doing it. And this is why we talked about before, like using Anki the right way. right? Being
Yeah.
really intentional about it. So kind of just wanted to add that because I think that was really important to make very, very clear.
Yeah. And I think it translates well into like how to use Anki effectively, right?
Mhm.
Because ultimately, like we've established what Anki is, we've established the benefit for retention, we've established how to access these pre-made decks, all this stuff. But like, I think it's important to really address the pros and cons of using somebody else's study material, right? So you addressed a structural concern of like, sometimes these closed deletions don't actually help test our knowledge. If our brain fills in the blank, our Ebbinghaus forgetting curve is not reset, right? We don't truly remember and recall and relearn that topic. We're kind of just, stamping that, seal of approval on and sending it off without actually having reviewed it. So structural concerns, for sure, make sure that you are learning in a way that is helping you actually review that material. And that's going to be different for everyone, but generally speaking, it's important to have different types of study resources. The other thing that I would say is, you know, you could definitely use these cards, but these are by definition something that someone else has made, which means these are all their words that they chose to use on their cards so that it helps them remember, right? And the hard thing is, again, all these decks were made by MCAT students. Sometimes they're inaccurate, or
Mhm.
a lot of the times they're accurate, but they're phrased in a way that actually doesn't make sense to you, right? So it's hard sometimes because when you especially try and learn from somebody else's deck rather than just use it for retention, although the problem is there in both cases, you are using someone else's explanation. And sometimes that doesn't sit right with you.
Mhm. Mhm. But we
And
try
I
to
fell
force
into
it,
that.
right? Right?
Yeah.
You try to force it. You're like, oh, well, if this super popular deck says it this way, this is how
Mhm.
I'm supposed to learn it, right? As if there's
Yes.
only one way to learn something. So, yeah,
Yes.
100% here. You have had so many students struggle with this. So I think
Yeah.
making that very clear, like the words that they use are not always the best words to
Yeah.
explain these things. Right?
Yeah,
100%.
and if you really do want the ease of integrating a pre-made deck, again, that's the biggest pro in that column is like it's already done. You already have a resource that you can pull from and use as you wish. If that pro is too appealing to you, one way that you can get around this is use the deck, but when you are reviewing it, if you recognize, you know what, I don't know that this definition makes a ton of sense to me, do some Googling and then just edit the card. The benefit is you've already downloaded it. So this is now your
Sure.
deck.
Hmm.
It's their material that they made, but if you make changes to that card, it's not like it's going to change the actual Mile Down or Jack Sparrow deck, right? You can edit your cards as much as you want. So if there's a picture that really helped this click for you, put it on the card. If the definition didn't make sense to you, change it, right? You can use these pre-made decks as starting materials to help create your own deck, which is
Right.
something I have a lot of feelings about. Mike, I think you do too.
Yeah, I again, there is so much, like everyone is in a different camp. Like if we talk to like every single instructor, like everyone probably sits in a different camp of like how are you supposed to use the pre-made decks? Like because like if we're to talk about like the pros and cons, right? Pro definitely. It's already there, right? It's already made for you. You don't have to spend the time, but that's also kind of a little bit of a con, right? Where because it's in making the cards that you can actually learn like you're learning while you're making the cards, right? Which is probably one of the biggest kind of like things I hear from students is like, oh, but making my own cards takes so much time. Like that's part of the studying. So it's like both a pro and a con, but big cons, like you said, right, is the oh, you're kind of going through the motions and not using your own words, right? Where it can actually lead to more confusion rather than actually learning. And I kind of want to talk about like how to like in terms of like setting up your settings like because again people are going to be making their own cards or be like using the pre-made cards like say you like okay I'm a student I'm downloading the deck right what do I do now do I just like dive right into the cards and start like clicking away like what do I do at that point.
Yeah. So I think this is super important because, again, the settings seem really scary. And most of the YouTube videos that I would see, especially done by medical students, like, they open Anki. They're like, this is what Anki looks like. All right, let's go into settings. And it's just these pages of adjustable things that you can change, like insertion order, review, the learning order and timing. How many cards do you want? How many reviews do you want? It's very overwhelming. Anyone who's downloaded Anki has probably had this experience of like, whoa, like I don't even know what 90% of this is and what it refers to. How do I know how to optimize it for myself? So again, just to reiterate what we said at the beginning, don't get too caught up in this, right? Some people out there have very specific, like this needs to be done this way. You don't necessarily need it, but I will share a perspective from our good friend Adam, who's our, one of the people that lead our tutoring department, who has very strong opinions, right? And I think they have a lot of merit. So if you are setting up your settings, this will help. He believes that everyone should do, as far as like new card allowance and reviews, 9,999, right? Just max them out. That looks like a lot, but
I'm like, oh my gosh, am I doing that many cards a day? Like what?
no. What that really means is you don't have like you need to do 100 new cards a day. You can review 200 cards a day. Like it's not assigned, right? It basically means you have available to you all of the cards that are testing on things that you've understood already. Again, don't learn from Anki for the first time, but you have access to everything. Do as much as you can in a day. Don't sit down and say like every single day I need to make sure I do X amount of cards, right? Ultimately, you shouldn't have access to every pre-made deck card, right? If you haven't learned something, don't do an Anki card on it yet. But ultimately, for the cards that you have, had some exposure to, do as many as you can. You don't need to feel like you have an assignment of 100 a day or 50 a day or 30 a day, right? It's something that you're going to chip away at and make sure that you are, making progress with.
Yeah, I think that really important thing where it's like, yes, you're setting 9,999 cards, but that does not mean you are doing that many per day. As
That would be
well,
crazy.
I know, right? I'm like, I got a little bit like, oh my gosh. But
Yeah.
then as well, there is also, again, this is from Adam, and everyone is going to be very different. You can change these numbers, but Adam, again, in his experience, he's a current medical student right now and feels very strongly about Anki that in terms of you can set the intervals for when you do a card, like what time intervals you see after you had a really hard time with the card. You didn't remember it well. When you had a medium, when you had an easy time with the card, right? Those three different categories, right? If you had a really hard time with the card, you can make a setting where you're going to see it in 15 minutes, right? Have that as setting. If you had a medium time, like it was just okay, you can set that to a day. And if you had like a really straightforward, it was right off the tip of your tongue, it was right out on the memory, 2 days, you can set that to. Again, in that way, whenever you click on it was hard, you will see it again. So again, you can retain that. You can kind of, again, your goal is to try to reset that curve as quickly as possible, right? And so by seeing it quickly after you had that hard time with it, it only serves to reinforce it. But where you're not seeing the same cards over and over that you really had an easy time. I think as well, Molly, you were mentioning before, we're not trying to learn new information from these cards. So like I download a deck, right? And now it's got thousands of these cards, right? How am I, a student, gonna make sure I only see the cards that I've learned?
Yeah. So a lot of the pre-made decks are actually pre-tagged and pre-sorted. I believe Mile Down is using the Kaplan books, but they're based on the subjects that are covered, or I guess the topics within each subject that are covered. So the idea is as soon as you download a pre-made deck, go in and select all the cards. You're going to right click and hit suspend. What that means is this is not a card. You're not going to show me any of these cards without me intentionally selecting the ones that I want to review and unsuspending them. Basically, you've banished them all and you're going to give specific cards or specific groups of cards basically permission to be tested. So this is very important. Again, we're not learning from Anki, but if you suspend the cards, you can then unsuspend the ones that you want to review. And those will now populate your deck. You can click on them and start practicing just what you've learned. Also, just to add, when Mike was talking about the 15 minutes, 1 day, 2 day, just so you know, in the settings, that's going to show up as learning steps. And you could literally put 15M for 15 minutes, 1D for 1 day, and 2D for 2 days. That is a hard thing to adjust in the Anki settings. So I wanted to make sure I explicitly clarified that. If you're using the Jack Westin flashcard thing, it's already all programmed for you in the most optimum or optimized way. So you don't have to worry about that if you use the one on our website. I know that that can be really complicated, but if you are using the app, that's where you'll put it, right? It'll be under learning steps. In the realm of, you know, suspending the pre-made cards and unsuspending when you've studied them, I wanna bring in a tip that I've been using, because I know I've been sharing that I really prefer making my own cards that kind of build that open-ended spreading activation model, right? Like I want to see define the photoelectric effect, and I want to rack my brain for everything that goes along with that, right? Some clothes are fine. Again, pKa of histidine sidechain, perfect, right? That's a number, something very specific, but I like those open-ended questions. The big con of that is that it takes time to make. And Mike, I know you were talking about the fact that this sometimes can be prohibitively, you know, time consuming, right? That being said, it's very, very active, and you can get the benefit of making your own deck with a couple little shortcuts. You could do that a lot faster, right? So one of the specific things that I will do, and I've advised my students to do, is go ahead and download the pre-made decks, right? And what you can do is if I want to make a card about the photoelectric effect or a competitive inhibitor or whatever it is, you can actually hit browse and go to the search tool and type in the buzzword or the vocab term you want to learn. And every card from all the pre-made decks that have made a card about it will all pop up. So if you type in photoelectric effect, you're going to get ones from Mile Down, from Jack Sparrow, from everything. You can click on those and scroll through the cards that have been made, and then make your own card, but just copy and paste the chunks that make sense. Use the images, the links that make sense to you from the pre-made deck. And now you have a tool that you made, but it was very fast and it was still very active because you're picking and choosing what clicked for you, and taking inspiration from the decks. But now it's all on one card as well. So I wanted to bring that up because I don't know that I've ever heard of anyone else doing that. But for me, that's been a game changer.
You mentioned it before. Like I think we were talking about this before, and you know, I've heard some strategies for using these cards, and I heard that and I was like, that's such like a kind of I don't want to reduce it down, but a simple idea, but can be so
Yeah.
powerful because again, one, especially for those like image cards, like the image occlusion cards, which are kind of
Yeah.
hard to make. Like they have some image occlusion cards in some of those decks. You can just
Yeah,
take that and then bring it to
totally.
your own. So it saves you time, but
Mhm.
again, it's active because you looked for the card. You're like, I know I need to
Mhm.
review this content area. I'm going to look for a card that tackles the thing that I am struggling with, the thing that I need to review. Again, very intentional. That's a word I love to use like throughout this,
Yes.
like being super intentional about your cards rather than being passive, which I feel like, and again, I feel like I'm generalizing here, but most students are using your cards very passively. So that's where I really want to bring the word intentional back into the conversation where we've got to have a purpose for when we use these cards. So I love that. When you brought that up, I was like, oh, we've got to talk about that. That's such a great, great, great tip. So highly recommend. Highly recommend to do.
Love it. Yeah, and it doesn't take that much time, which is lovely. Again, that's kind of the biggest con of making your own cards. But the thing that is true of having your own cards, maybe not as true if we use the pre-made decks in a traditional sense, is we do not need every topic on the MCAT to be in our flashcard deck, right? Like if you already know something, again, think back to what we were talking about with the forgetting curve. If you know that aspartate and glutamate are acidic, why would you throw a card in circulation that's asking you about the characteristics of aspartate and glutamate? Like if you already know that those are acidic, negatively charged side chains, like why would you waste your time reviewing a card like that? Like you're not going to forget. You're already at that nice retention. You've got it already. So the benefit there is just assign cards from the pre-made deck or make cards for the stuff that you specifically need to learn as an individual, right? Again, comes back to intention. I love it. The other thing that I hear from students all the time is like, okay, how many cards do I need to do?
Mm,
Um,
probably the most common. Like I'm like, how many cards
yes.
should I do? Every single one I introduce. Okay, like 100, 200, like how many? What a
Yeah.
great thing to talk about.
Yeah. I feel like it comes down to the intention as well. Like you please, if you take one thing from this, please don't just download Mile Down and divide the number of cards by the number of days that you have. I did this and it was very unhelpful, and I feel like I wasted a lot of time. If you want broad content coverage, there are much better ways to do it. But it comes down to, again, assigning or unsuspending those cards that are relevant to what you need to learn and that you have identified as, I need to review this stuff. It's worth adding another card to my deck to study because I need to retain this information. And that's going to be very different for everybody. I will say, personally, I favor having fewer cards that test on more information. Everyone is very different. It kind of goes back to, is this a closed style with one very small discrete fact you're learning? Or is this a concept with that open-ended note? But just for, I guess, a specific example, I have a deck that I've been adding to over the years. I've been studying MCAT related material since 2020 to 2021. So it's been a couple years now. And I think right now my deck, which again, I made using the strategy before of like kind of picking and choosing from other decks, I think it's got like 800 or 900 cards, right? So like
And over like almost 5 years.
years. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you don't need to have 5,000 cards under your belt, right? If you do have 5,000 cards under your belt, you probably are not being quite as intentional. It's not a bad thing, but again, I know for me at least, I'm very selfish with my time. I want to get the most value out of every minute I spend studying as I physically can because I'm busy. I got a lot of stuff that I want to do with my time. So I'm all about the intentionality of it. And again, kind of getting the most bang for your buck in terms of your studying.
Right. No, I totally agree because like you want to be making time for the review, but then being really intentional about it. Again, I know I'm rinsing this word, like everyone's gonna be sick about it by the time, but like again, I think it's so important that like you don't just want to go through the motions. Like I need to hit my 100 cards and then be done with it. No, like I would rather a student did like 20 cards, but they were super intentional about every single one. They saw a card that they were like, wow, I really, photoelectric effect, for example. I saw that card and I couldn't explain it. I'm gonna take a second and I'm gonna review the photoelectric effect. I'm gonna maybe draw a little map, maybe a little whiteboard to actually like walk myself through it. Oh,
Did
oh,
somebody say
somebody said
whiteboard?
what? Always at the ready. It is always at the ready. I
It is
100%.
always here for me.
Right? But like again, take that second to be like, okay, wait, I had that card and I didn't like again, it was like, what is the photoelectric effect? Take that second and go. Again, are you not spending time looking at the other cards? You're not. But again, you are now this time is now so golden. It's so valuable. I would rather a student do that rather than go through 80 cards that were all just what's the blank? What's the blank? What's the blank? Not that that's
Yes.
not important, but again, in terms of value, right? I think what you were saying, Molly, I think you do like maybe 20 cards a day ish.
I would think so. So for the most part, like when the way that I like to do cards, and again, this is very personal to me. I've kind of shared the types of cards that I like to do. I would, yeah, probably like do maybe 20 a day. I mean, I don't have 20 new cards to learn every day, right? I personally will compile them as I learn stuff using the strategies we've talked about. So I will do as many as I've made, right? But normally, like let's say I did a really heavy study day and I made 60 cards, right? I would probably do about 20 a day for a couple days. And then, and this is really important too, as soon as you get a review scheduled, do it. Again, the whole idea is the timing to remind you of this material or prompt you to review it when you need to avoid forgetting. So if you let reviews sit in your inbox, so to speak, for days, you probably forgot it already, right? Like we've missed that window to really improve our retention. So I start with my reviews and then I integrate usually about 20 cards. If I have a particularly heavy review day, maybe I'll do 15, right? If I have a light review day, maybe I'll do 30. Personally, I highly recommend habit stacking Anki to make sure that you can get to it every day. Personally, I get to it every day when I make my coffee in the morning. I wake up early enough that I know I have like, 30 minutes to an hour of what I like to call big brain time, right? Like my mind is waking up. I don't have people texting me. I don't have all these distractions. I make my coffee. I sit on my couch. I screen share my my phone or my iPad or my computer to my TV, and I'll sit there and I'll sip my coffee. I got my whiteboard. I do my cards, and then I go off and get started with my day. So it doesn't need to be 3 or 4 hours a day. It doesn't need to be anything incredibly time consuming, but I think the consistency of it and the regularity of it is really key to make sure that you get the most out of this resource.
Yeah, and this kind of relates back to like some things we talked about in like the last episode about like building those habits, building things for sustainability. And
Yeah.
so like integrating these things, 100%, 100%. And so in terms of like kind of building off that, in terms of like hours in the day, if someone were to ask like, okay, I don't have a specific number, but how much time in my day should I be spending on my Anki? What would you think?
I mean, I usually think, depending on the day, anywhere between 30 minutes and an hour.
Yeah.
A lot of the students that I see that are doing Anki for like 3, 4 hours a day are the ones that are pulling the, 3,500 cards from Mile Down and Anking and just saying, I have 100 days and there's 3,500 cards, so I'll do 35 a day, right? And it's just like
Mm,
showing up and just kind of like checking the box. But again, it depends on the day and how much
mhm,
you have to review. I would set aside at least 30 minutes to get the
mhm.
reviews done and the new cards done. Sometimes it's closer to an hour. If
Yes.
you're spending 2 hours on it, your brain's going to check out, right? Like you
Yeah.
could, but then do an hour in the morning, an hour in the evening, right? Don't
Mhm.
just sit there staring at your Anki deck for more than an hour, I would say.
Right. Absolutely.
Especially because if you're using it right, this should be exhausting, right?
Mhm.
That's the idea.
Right. Like it's like you're again actively resetting the curve. It will be tiring. Like if you're going 3 hours, you're not really resetting the curve. And
Yes.
so I think this brings us to kind of like one of the last big points about like how to know what you don't know. Like sometimes it's hard. Like with Anki, I feel like I'm very directed when it comes to Anki. Like, okay, I need to review amino acids. All right, let me
Mhm.
do some review cards. But how would I figure out like what I don't know? Like what would you recommend for that, Molly?
Well, what I would recommend is actually exactly what you did.
Hmm.
So, what I would say is if you want just broad exposure to the different content areas that you could see on the exam, which is actually a common reason why people will download something like the Mile Down deck. Like they just want to see like, is there anything that I haven't seen before that I'm going to be tested on? Like, is there a psych-soc term that I didn't know that I needed to know? A lot of people use Anki for that. Again, it's not a tool designed for learning. It's a tool designed for retention. In my opinion, the best way to do it is actually how you apply it, which is practice questions. So I want to hear
Love
your
practice
thoughts on this,
questions.
actually.
I feel so strongly about practice questions. Like use
Yes.
them early, use them often, so that you know, like you know how this information is being applied. Not just for after you learn it, but also like after some time, also to review to know what you don't know. And like one
Mhm.
of the actually we just like released like an email like recently, like showing everyone like our totally free content diagnostic where like
Mhm.
you can actually go completely free on our website. You can actually go and take a content diagnostic in each of the content areas bio, campus, psych, social, and it will give you a breakdown of each content area based on the
Love it.
questions that we asked in the diagnostic and to tell you, hey, what's your percentage? What's your confidence? How'd you do on these questions? And this kind of gives you a direction. Like I think that's the one of the biggest thing, a direction on review, right? Where
Yes.
you can use now you're like, okay, I can see biochem is something I struggle with. My glycolytic pathway, my glycolytic flux. I don't get that. You can use the
Mhm.
AMC outline. You can like that we again another great resource that we have on our a totally free resource that we have on our website that pairs up super well with our diagnostic and you can now go actively learn it because now again you did a practice question on it you figured out the gap and now you can go actively learn it from the
Yeah.
AMC outline, from whatever resource, if you're using textbooks, if you're using videos. And then now you have something to review. You can make a card, or you can pull a card from a pre-made deck and add that to your deck. Because now that's something you've actively learned, you've tested yourself, and now again, now you're building your deck intentionally rather than passively. I love doing this for practice questions.
Yes. I love that you bring it back to the intentionality too. And it even to kind of share a closing thought here, right? To draw it back to what we started with, which was different learning resources are designed to shape your learning in different ways. We talked about the different types of cards and how they each kind of hit at a different level of understanding. Memorization, very visually based or very in-depth conceptual understanding. We talked even about just what the function of Anki is with learning over truly understand or sorry, retaining over actually learning,
Mhm.
right? With practice questions, it is kind of a dual function of it's testing your understanding and your retention, but structurally, this is as similar to the real exam as possible, right? Like structurally, this is exactly how your real exam is going to look. So why not, especially now that you're comfortable with the learning and the basic retention, why not start integrating lots of practice questions? Because that's going to bridge that gap between I learned this concept and I've studied the card and I retain it can I apply it? Right? That's really the segue into making sure that you can succeed on your exam. As we always say here, this is not a content test, it's a strategy and a critical thinking test, right? So you need to be doing passages. And as you mentioned, we have so many passages available. You talked about our content diagnostic. Those are actually passage lists, just a bunch of content-based multiple choice questions to kind of get a sense of what you know and what you don't, and using the AMC outline to help fill in those gaps. But we also release daily passages every day. We've got a huge Q bank available to you. And of course, you have access to all of the AMC materials. That actually brings us to our next topic for our next episode, which is how should I use these AMC materials and when throughout my practice should I integrate all of these different resources that the AMC provides?
Yeah,
So
well, that's one of the most
we're
common
excited.
questions. Yeah, one of the most common questions I get, it's like, should I start on the question bank? Should I start on the section bank? Like, where do you start? We're going to go into all of that in so much detail next episode. So stick around for episode 4 where we talk about all that stuff.
Yeah, I can't wait. We're gonna talk all about it. So stay tuned. If you didn't catch our previous episodes, definitely go check them out. Right? Again, we talked about 10 things you really need to know to succeed on your exam. So we will catch you in the next one. In the meantime, happy studying, everyone.
Bye now, everyone.